This will be my full review of the new Niner RIP9. I've been riding this bike for 3 months on a wide variety of terrain, from cross-country trails to full-on shuttle days. Is this new RIP9 the best one yet? Stay tuned to find out. I'll start off by covering something that I did in the first look video of this bike, and that is the fact that you have to use a shock adapter. I actually bought another one, so I have one in my toolbox. I just keep that one on the frame just in case I need it. So it does take a little bit longer to pump up the shock, but it actually ended up being a non-issue. After the initial setup, I only adjusted the pressure in the rear shock one time, and I don't mind it because having this extra ribbing around the shock really improves the frame stiffness. I also really like this gauge that you have. You can easily set the sag. You don't have to, reset the O-ring, get on the bike, get off, look at it, measure the O-ring. All you do is sit on the bike and look at the gauge. And so that really actually makes up for the fact that you have to use the adapter. Speaking of frame stiffness, this bike does pay off by having a very stiff frame. So Niner flattened the top tube, they beefed up the rear triangle, they widened this link, and of course this rib cage around the shock all really pay off to make the bike nice and stiff. And I'll talk a little bit more about the ride quality, but I can tell you it's not hype. This frame is plenty stiff, which really helps when you're going down rough descents, going through rock gardens. The bike really just holds its line. In order to make the chainstay shorter, Niner had to move their link up a little bit, and that results in the lower link actually being below the chain ring. So that's a little bit of a negative in the fact that you can hit it from time to time. I probably hit it maybe 3 times while riding this bike, particularly when going up a climb and going over a log. Now, Niner does include this little plastic guard underneath, and so it actually acts as a little bit of a bash guard. So even though it may look like it's an issue, you don't have to have a bash guard. Instead of hitting your chain ring and your chain, which is a lot less durable than this link, it does actually, like I said, act as a bash guard. And you can see it, it's not really banged up. I think I hit it on a rock and a couple logs. So that's not that big of an issue, but I just wanted to point that out. Just a couple real quick component highlights before I get into the ride quality. I feel like the bar and stem combination on this bike was spot on. The stem I think is a 40, so it's pretty short. The bars are 780, and perfect spec for this bike. This bike is more enduro than trail, and I'll talk about that when I talk about the ride quality. So I feel like the cockpit combination is a good spec for the bike. The dropper seat post is excellent. It's super smooth. You can run up to a 170 dropper seat post. This bike is a medium and comes with a 150 dropper seat post. The large and extra large Niners come with a 170, and the smalls come with a 125. And speaking of the sizing, like I said, it's a medium, and I'm 5'8". This bike fits me really well, so you can use that as kind of a gauge. As always, if you like a super nimble bike, you would want to size down a little bit if you're on the border, or size up if you want a more stable ride. The last component that I'll mention is the saddle, and this Niner saddle is excellent. Sometimes it's hard to find an OEM saddle that works. This one works really well. I don't have any plans to replace it. A lot of times I'll replace the stock saddle with a WTB Silverado. Like I said, I'm not going to do that like the saddle on this bike. Now let's talk about the ride quality of this new Niner. And by the way, this is the 29. They of course make it in a 27.5, but I'm reviewing the 29. So I consider this bike, especially the 29er version, more of an enduro bike than a trail bike. On cross-country trails and smoother trails like I rode up in North Georgia, I actually felt like this bike was a little bit beefy, a little bit too burly for those kind of trails. It was not until I got the bike up into North Carolina, particularly Pisgah, where I rode trails like Black Mountain, where I felt like this bike really came into its element. It went from feeling a little bit too burly, a little bit too beefy for all-around trail riding to being perfect. So it's got a 150 mil travel fork in the front, and of course 40 millimeters of travel in the back. Being a 29er that has a 44 millimeter offset, fork offset, so a reduced fork offset. The head angle is 66 in the high position, 65 in the low position, which I'll talk about changing the geometry here in a minute. But I feel like all of those combinations make this bike feel a little bit more enduro. Now, what's nice about this bike is I don't feel like it's full-blown enduro like the new Specialized Enduro that just came out with 170 front and back, and even the new Giant Rain has a little bit more travel. This bike sits in a really nice position, being, I think, kind of between trail and enduro. Like I said, all around trail riding that has smoother trails, this bike's a little bit overkill, but once you hit those rough descents, the enduro side of this bike comes out, and I loved this bike on the rough, chunky terrain that I rode in North Carolina. While I was in North Carolina, we did a shuttle day at Bailey Mountain Bike Park, and I dropped this bike into the low setting, and it was actually the only time that I put the bike in the low setting. So it's fairly easy to do. It took me probably, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes to do that. I did lose one of the screws here and ended up just leaving the other one out. So that one kind of rattled out. So if you get this bike, make sure those screws are tight. They just hold that little plate in, which is, you know, it just makes it a little bit easier to change the flip chip. So you just pull the bolt out right here, flip this around, and put it back in. Like I said, it's fairly quick and easy to do. And I was glad I did it at Bailey Mountain Bike Park. So how did this bike do as a shuttle day? So on the kind of intermediate trails at Bailey Mountain Bike Park, it was great. It felt right in its element. When I went on the super steep, a little bit slick, a little bit rough trails, this bike was a little bit undergunned. Even though it's kind of, you know, more enduro, it wasn't full enduro, like, you know, with 170 front and back. So it kind of got a little bit sketchy. I couldn't really just go all out. I had to really kind of use the brakes, stay on the brakes on some of the real steep sections, but it did okay. You know, next time I probably would just rent a downhill bike. Downhill bikes were better for that track, for the expert trails. But it's kind of a testament of this bike of how well it can do in the really steep and rough terrain. One thing that I really appreciated about riding this bike up in North Carolina, and any trail that has steep, rugged climbs, is the 29er wheels just do a phenomenal job getting over roots and rocks that could really slow your momentum down. And I ended up liking the Stansflow wheels. I may try some carbon wheels. In fact, I'm probably going to put my carbon wheels from my Giant Trance 29er on this bike. But when I was up in North Carolina, and also a trip out to Washington State where we rode Galbraith Mountain, I saw a lot of enduro bikes with Stansflow wheels. So this is a really good spec. Like I said, a lot of enduro bikes today are coming with these wheels. Would carbon wheels be better? I think so. I like carbon wheels. I like the fact that they allow the bike to be more playful. The only downside is carbon wheels can make the bike a little bit harsh. So the bottom line is, I feel like the Stansflows that came on this bike is a really good spec. Another thing that really helped the climbing capabilities of this bike is Niner CVA suspension. I really like suspension that does not have to have a shock that is overly damped, so really having to increase the compression damping. So those would include Niner CVA, Giant Maestro, Santa Cruz VPP. So they use the linkages to stiffen up the rear end a little bit when you're pedaling hard, and it does work. Niner built this suspension with a leverage ratio that decreases as the bike goes more into its travel. So what that means is the bike is a little bit more compliant for the small bumps, and then when you get into the bigger hits, the travel ramps up a little bit. So that allows for a bike that, like I said, is compliant on the small hits, but does not bottom out harshly. And it does work, it does a good job. CVA suspension has become one of my favorite suspension designs. So let's talk about the bottom bracket height, which is a topic for new bikes today coming out, especially enduro bikes. And you gotta say the phrase that we're probably all sick of hearing, and that's longer, lower, slacker. So with the lower, that typically refers to the center of gravity, which of course includes a bottom bracket that's lower. So it's good in the fact that your center of gravity is lower, the bike corners better, it's more stable. So this bike has a 32 millimeter bottom bracket drop. When you put the bike in the low setting, it drops another 7 millimeters, so that puts it down to 39 millimeters. So like I said, it's nice and stable, but you will get pedal strikes from time to time. And I had a pedal strike when I was in Georgia. It was kind of a momentary lapse of judgment where I was fiddling with my GoPro on my chest. I had the pedal down and I was not really paying attention, and there was just one rock in the trail and I hit it and I went flying off the bike. I got a banged up knee, and the bike pretty much fared okay. It wasn't until a little while later I noticed that there was a scratch on the frame, which I really hate getting scratches on a new frame. I think it happened in that crash. It could have happened from a rock coming off the wheel, but I think it was during that crash because it was the first time that I noticed that spot. It's only cosmetic, it's just the paint, but it's still annoying. So the point is, with these lower bottom brackets, you really have to pay attention and be careful when you're coming on terrain where you can get pedal strikes. It's most annoying when you're climbing. So when you're going up over logs and rocks and roots, you can hit your pedals. Now what helps, what some bike companies are doing, the new Giant Rain, Specialized does this on their stump jumper, they probably do it on their new Enduro, is putting 170 cranks on the bike. This bike comes with 175. I wish Niner would have done 170. So it's just something that I want to mention. It is probably worth working out with your dealer if you can. See if they will swap the cranks for you. Some dealer might be able to do that. The bigger ones, the smaller ones, probably not. But if you absolutely hate pedal strikes, but you want to get this bike, you may want to think about swapping the cranks out to 170. One thing that I also want to mention about the geometry, if you're familiar with Specialized and you watched my videos on the stump jumper, I feel like in the high setting, this bike feels like the stump jumper did in the low setting. So this bike is more aggressive for descending than bikes like the stump jumper, and the reduced offset also affects that. So the stump jumper had a 51 millimeter offset. So I just wanted to mention that in case, again, you're familiar with bikes like the stump jumper and you want to do some comparison. One thing that you can do on this bike in order to make it a little bit more trail oriented, if you want a bike that's kind of a dual personality, so you ride smoother terrain, but then you do trips to the mountains like I do, you can put on some smaller tires. So maybe some 2.35s, 2.4s. This bike has 2.5s on both the front and the rear. So by putting on some less aggressive tread, a little bit narrower tires, maybe even getting a second set of wheels, so some carbon wheels, I think you can really transform the personality of this bike. Like I said, I'm going to be doing some testing with some carbon wheels, smaller tires on this bike. I'll make that a whole separate video. So stay tuned for that video coming out, because that may help you, again, if you're wanting to get a bike like this or get this bike, but also maybe have it be a little bit more trail, maybe even a little bit more cross country for certain riding applications. So to sum up this review, this bike absolutely rips on the downhills. It is a bike that, like I said, a little bit more enduro than trail, but you can ride this as a trail bike. You're not going to keep up with people on cross-country bikes, but that's okay. That's not why you buy a bike like this. You buy this bike for descending. So it gets up the climbs without a fuss. You're not going to set Strava KOMs going up a climb, but it does fine going up the climbs. And then when you're descending, the increased stiffness of the bike really pays off. There's very little lateral flex. When you're going through rock gardens, the bike will hold its line. It does not wallow around. So I would put this bike in the category of bikes like the Transition Sentinel, the Yeti SB 150. These are all boutique brand bikes with kind of the same focus. Enduro bikes that kind of blur the lines between trail and enduro. There are some really good bikes coming out on the market today, and the new Niner RIP9 is no exception. This is a bike that I can hands down recommend. I feel like the 3-star build is probably the best value. Never once riding this bike did I wish for any components that were better, except for, like I said, carbon wheels. But as far as the shifting, the braking, everything has been spot on. And of course, the Fox suspension on this bike is absolutely my preference. You've got the Kashima coating on both the rear shock and the front shock. So this bike is spec'd really well. You know, Niner did keep the price down a little bit by putting on the alloy wheels. So I feel like that was kind of a smart move. So the bike didn't just get crazy expensive. So like I said, this is a bike that I can totally recommend. Like I'd mentioned before, a little bit burly for smoother trails, but once you hit the descents, this bike just comes alive. And I don't know about you, but I love descending on a bike. It's why I buy a bike with this much travel. I want to hit the descents and have a good time. So as always, questions, comments that you have about this review, about this bike, go ahead and drop those below. Thanks for watching.